Hello. Hello.
Sir, good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Yes, sir.
So we conducted it here or in YouTube?
Yes, sir. It is also live in YouTube, sir.
Okay, good.
Yes, sir. In another 10 minutes, participants will be joining, sir. So once that we reach some maximum participants, we can start the session, sir.
Admissions என்ன ரீநேம் பண்ணுவா இத இந்த சிஸ்டம்
வந்து
co-host system
இல்ல வெறும் MV80 மட்டும் வச்சிரீங்களா
MV80 system
Professor Yasir, sir.
Yes, Dr. Pungal.
Sir, I have given you as a co-host, so you can start sharing your screen. Not now, but after some time. So you have the privilege to share your screen, sir.
But it seems I still don't have it. I've just tried it.
Sir, now you can just try it, sir. Now you can try it, sir.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir. Now we can see your screen, sir.
Can you please confirm, Dr. Pungrali, if you can see my screen?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It is visible, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Your screen is visible, sir. You can make it as full screen, sir. You can go to the presentation mode, sir.
Sure. Give me.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. 51, ma'am. So previously it was full screen, sir. Now again it has come to the design mode, sir.
Just a moment, I'll fix it.
Yes,
Fixing
sir.
it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Shall I share it now, or you have anything to share before that?
Sir, you can have the screen itself, sir. After a few minutes, we can start, sir. I'll just give an introduction. I'll give a welcome note. Then we can start it, sir.
Sure. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. A very good morning to one and all present here. So I welcome to you the second day of Allied Series 1, Enhanced Learning Innovative for Technical Excellence. So on behalf of the Manaklavinnaga Institute of Technology, I welcome all the participants and also the today's speaker, Dr. Yasir Ahmed sir, who is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Information Security Engineering Technology at Abu Dhabi Polytechnic. Sir has earned his bachelor degree from the University of Kashmir in the year 2011 and the master degree from the University of Kashmir in the year 2014 and PhD in computer science and engineering in the year 2019 from Pondicherry University. Before working at Poly, he has worked as an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science, Islamic University of Science and Technology. Before, he had worked as a teaching assistant in the Department of Computer Science, Pondicherry Engineering College. During his brief experience, he has taught both fundamental and core subjects pertaining to the field of computer science. He is an editorial board member of many journals and he is also a member of the many scientific societies in this area. His research interests include machine learning, deep learning and big data analysis. So now I welcome you, sir. Now you can start the session, sir.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Bungrali, for the awesome introduction. A very good morning to all the participants here. Before start, I should thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk on this topic. But I feel like the time you have given is very less, actually 1 hour. I don't think that I will be even able to be finishing my presentation in this time. But anyway, we'll start it. So before I go forward, I don't think so that I need to justify the importance of internet. Of course, all of us know that it has revolutionized the modern days, right? Not an area has gone through which hasn't been touched by the internet. You talk of an area and you will find internet or connectivity there, right? From business to leisure, from education to entertainment. Just talk of an area and you would find internet already has its roots there, right? With this convenience of global connectivity, internet has been, and this network, it has been under constant threats from the users with the destructive mindsets. So we are in a constant battle of safeguarding the things from the people who are actually upgrading their skills to defeat our defensive mechanism. Now, in today's presentation, I will briefly talk about the things, and after we finish, by the end of this topic, or by the end of this presentation, most of us would be actually educated about certain things that we should be doing, certain little things that we usually take for granted, but that would prove a major disaster if they are to be capitalized by the users with the destructive mindsets. So let me quickly walk you through the table of contents for today's presentation. So we'll first talk about why do we need security in the first place? Okay, who does need it?
Excuse me, Professor. Excuse me, sir. Sir, your screen is not visible, sir.
It's not visible?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry about it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Is it visible now?
No, sir. No, sir. Not yet, sir.
Just a moment.
Yes, sir.
How about now?
Yes, sir. You can go to the presentation mode, sir.
My bad.
Yes, sir. Now it's visible, sir. You can continue, okay, sir. Yes, sir.
Now, the topics we're going to cover in this presentation very briefly is why do we need security? Who needs it? Now, what security problems are there? Okay. Then we talk briefly about Security Trinity. I hope that anybody of you who has taken a course of fundamentals of information security, who would have come across all these terms. Then types of network vulnerabilities, attacks, and finally we'll talk about security principles that you might actually take into account while designing network systems so that you are left at least with some level of safety. Okay. Now, the basic aim of the security is to make information accessible to the people who are authorized to use it and make it accessible as and when it is needed. Now, this is basically two-sided theorem here. You make it accessible to the people who are authorized to use it. At the same time, you deny its access to the people who are not authorized to use it. As simple as it seems. Now, that is basically your cyber security, or that is basically your network security. You make resources, devices, and services. You make them available for the people who are authorized to use it. Make them accessible to those people, and make it basically unavailable, make it inaccessible, make it, practically unusable for the people who are not authorized to use that. Now, that is basically your security. That is what we are aiming for. Now, all these devices, methods, methodologies, policies, and principles, they are brought, or they are actually developed just to uphold these two principles: make it accessible for the people who are authorized to use it, and make it inaccessible for the people who are not authorized to use it. Now, let me here stop here and ask you a certain question. Now, who do you think is vulnerable on the internet? Your financial institutions, which are having, a lot of data. They do have the financial data, they do have the customer data. Your pharmaceutical companies, your advertisement companies, your government organizations. Now, everybody who is on internet, he is vulnerable. All of us would have, even in this very brief usage of the internet, all of us would have. Yes, Rohit, you have anything to share here? Rohit? Okay, if you don't have anything to share, please lower your hand here. So anybody who is on internet, he is basically vulnerable. His identity is at stake. Now, you decide to be on the internet, for sure you are going to be vulnerable. Now, your systems can be developed in two types. One would be a closed system that doesn't interact with the outside world. For sure, if you are having a closed system, you would be having enough of security. But you cannot survive in modern world being a closed system. You have to interact with the outside systems as well. The sooner you interact with the outside world, you actually open up to the vulnerabilities. Now, everybody who is using internet or using network, for sure, he is vulnerable to the things. Now, let me talk briefly about the terminology that we're going to be using in this presentation here, or in this lecture here. A security attack. A security attack is any attempt or an action that compromises the security of a system. Now, attack can be very simple from the password guessing, or it can be very high-end attack wherein you are compromising or you are breaking down the services, you are rendering them inaccessible. Now, that is a security attack. Any set of actions. Keep it in mind, a security attack is just not one step, but it's a collection of steps. A collection of steps that are aimed at compromising the security of a system. Now, to defend against these attacks, we are having security mechanisms. Some of the security mechanisms might be preventive in nature. We call them as a first line of security mechanisms, while as some of them might be detective or passive. We call them as a second line of defense. Now, if you are to categorize, you can consider firewalls. How many of you have already known about firewalls? All of you, I guess, right? So firewalls, they comprise your primitive or primary level of defense. They try to prevent an attack from reaching the systems. They try to separate something that you deem is secure from something that you deem is insecure. Or in other words, we can say a firewall is a device that protects your internal network from your external network. Now, that is just a preventive measure. Now, there are reasons, or there are ways your firewalls can be circumvented. Firewalls might not be able to protect you against all the types of attacks. Now, if you do not have any second line of defense at your disposal, you would be left at the hacker's mercy. You would be left at your attack. Now, at that point of time, you should need a second level of defense. We call those defensive mechanisms as defensive mechanisms. Okay. Now, your intrusion detection systems, your antivirus systems, your honeypot system, they comprise your second level of defense. That is basically defensive in nature. Finally, a security mechanism has some response. Response might be active or it might be a passive. In case of active response, you might close up the connection, you might block the account, you might block the IP address, you might close down the ports. Now, in case of passive response, what you do, you just take a log of the event, you just inform the administrator about that, and that's it. Then finally, you are having a security service. A security service, it enhances the security of your information processing system. As we go forward, we'll see a security services. It basically uses a set of security devices or security mechanisms. Now, I hope that's clear up to here. Now, the security problem, to understand this problem, you have to understand this diagram here. Now, what is depicted here is that we are having three things that you try to maintain a balance between: functionality, usability, and ease of access. Sorry, functionality, security, and ease of use, or we call it as usability as well. Now, if you move this ball towards security, you can have enough level of security, but you would be having very little of functionality and very little of usability. Now, your objective as a security expert is that to balance or to find out an equilibrium point for this ball, wherein you are having enough of functionality, enough of security, and enough of usability. Now that is something, that is basically what you are aiming at as a security expert. You have to have enough of everything. You cannot, of course, if you want all the security, you would need to compromise on the functionality, or you would need to make a system that is actually unusable. For sure, if you are creating a password system that needs 128 characters a minimum, and then it has to have special characters at certain special places, and then you can have a lot of security, you can have very high level of security, but at the same time such system would be unusable. And you might have a closed system. A closed system, as I just told you, it doesn't interact with the outside world, so it has no functionality at all. Now that closed system is for sure going to be secure, but at the same time it has no functionality at all. Now that is just the part of the problem. Now the problem that we are dealing with has been complicated over the years with the technology advancements. In the previous cases, the attacks, they were very simple, very primitive in nature, and the people who comprised those attacks or who were capable of carrying out those attacks, they didn't need, or they were actually security, they had to be security geeks. But nowadays, what's that? Okay, now as we have moved forward, technology has evolved. Now you are having sophisticated attack tools or GUI-based attack tools, wherein you do not need in-depth of this security knowledge to be capable of compromising any system. Now that is something that has been hindered, or that has been basically a cause of headache for all the security experts. Now every novice, every script kiddie is capable of hacking a system. He is capable of breaking your security posture. Now you are on a constant battle. Now you have to you're basically a constant battle. A security expert is basically fighting with a security geek or a security cracker. Now, though the security expert is evolving with time, at the same time the hackers are evolving as well. Now you cannot rest at any point of time. You have to be on your toes at all points of time. Now that's the problem. Now the Security Trinity, to deal with the security issues, you are having three things that you should be capable of doing. The first, as I told you, is prevention. Prevention, detection, and response. Any system might be having a group or might be having a single of this characteristics. Now, prevention, first line of defense, you try to prevent an attack. You put in a firewall, you put access control lists, you put cryptography, you put all that stuff just to prevent an attack from reaching the end system. But let me tell you one thing very honestly. In case of cybersecurity, prevention is definitely not a cure. Given enough level or given enough time and enough resources, a hacker would eventually be capable or would eventually be able to break into your security system. So your prevention would definitely not be capable of, safeguarding you at all points of time. Now, if your prevention system prevention system is basically defeated, now you need to have a defensive mechanism. Now, the defensive mechanism, it is the set of all those systems that try to basically detect the presence of an attack. Now, you go and you rely on the second line of defense, your defensive mechanism, your intrusion detection systems. As I previously told you, they are basically your defensive mechanisms. Now, finally, your prevention or your defensive mechanisms, they have to have some kind of response. Now, this response, as I just told you, it can be active response, wherein they try to basically block the connections, they try to discard any of the data, or wherein they basically try to block user IPs, they try to block certain ports. That is basically an active response. Or you can have a passive response. In case of passive response, you just don't do any of it. Rather, you just log the network connections. Once logged the network connection, you you inform the administrator about any of these issues. But the constraint here is that it has to be all done in the real time. Now, if your attacker is already in your secure premises and you are leaving him undetected for too long, for sure the damage that would be done would be huge. So your responsibility, or your IDS's or your defensive mechanism's responsibility, is to uncover the presence of any malicious user inside your premises in the real time. And finally, you are having that response, as I just told you. Now, the security services, you should be basically having all the security system. They offer certain level of security services. As I just told you, it's a mechanism to ensure that these are the set of services that provide you security. Now, basically, 3 set of security services should be provided by any security setup. Now, you can have confidentiality. You should be having confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Only when you have all of these things, you can claim that you are having enough of the security. Now, confidentiality. Confidentiality means what? It means making the information available to the users who should have access to it. Now, how do I ensure confidentiality? I ensure confidentiality by something like encryption, by steganography. Those are my confidentiality techniques, right? I hide the information from the people who are not authorized to use it. The integrity means to make sure that the information has not been changed in the transit, right? Information hasn't been changed. Now, how do I maintain the integrity of the data? I maintain integrity of the data by computing the hash of the message at the sender, at the receiver. Now, these hashes are basically one-way functions. It's very easy for us to basically compute a hash value from a message, but it's next to impossible to compute a hash message from a hash value. Now, that is called hash value. Now, the fundamental thing over which these hashing algorithms or hashing functions work, that is called something avalanche effect. Avalanche effect means if your message has been changed even by a single bit, your hash of that message would change drastically. There is no proportionality. There is no one-to-one mapping, kind of you change one bit and your hash number changes by 1 bit. No, it basically results in something called avalanche effect, wherein a single bit of message change would basically lead to a drastic change in your hash. Now, that is something you try to use for your integrity. Your digital signature systems, they make use of hashing. Your your digital certificates, they make use of these hash. Now, finally, availability. Availability means making resources available as and when needed to the users who are authorized to use it. Now, you guarantee availability by having backups, by having redundant services, by having the hot backups that are capable of servicing. Even if one service is down, the other is capable of taking up the load and basically servicing all the services. Now, I just told you that you are on the constant battle with the attacker. You are evolving. Cybersecurity is a real business. Organizations have been built that basically try to tackle these issues. But still, we are not capable of defeating, or we are not capable of winning this battle at this point of time. What are the issues that basically pop up, so that basically keeps us on our foot? So we cannot claim that we are having enough of security. We cannot claim that we are having absolute security. Now these are the issues responsible for you guys not being capable of having the absolute security. The speed of attacks, your attacks have been carried out at a very faster speed. You are given very little time by the attacker to get up on your feet to basically plan your responses. So attacks happen at a very faster speed. Previously there might have been hundreds of attacks in a month. Now you cannot even basically deny having around 100,000 attacks in a per day globally, right? Now that is the speed of attacks. It has basically been enormous. Now that is something that has basically made things very difficult for you. And not just the speed of attacks, the sophistication of the attacks has been also basically improved over the years. Previously, your attacks might have been very simple. You had a very little knowledge. The attackers had very little knowledge to compromise your system. And now the attackers are basically evolving, that they have taken this this field, they have taken it as a career. So for sure, they will be evolving with time. So that is basically making your lives difficult. The simplicity of attack tools as well. As I just told you, in the previous time, you might basically only few people might be capable of carrying out attacks. Maybe it would basically need, a high level of programming capabilities. But now you are having sophisticated attack tools, GUI-based attack tools. We are in technical expertise. Basically, in that much of technical expertise might not be needed at all. Then delay in patching. Now you find a vulnerability. You have to release a patch for it, but you cannot instantly create a patch and release a patch. Now that takes certain time, certain planning. The patching itself is basically a project that has to be executed. Now for this project to be executed, it certainly takes time. So that means from the point of time the vulnerability got disclosed to the point of time the patch is available, your system are basically vulnerable. Your systems are basically they are basically prone to the attacks. And then distributed attacks. How many of you, all of us know about distributed denial of services. Previously, attack would basically come up from a single PC and you would be basically able to block that PC. But now your attackers, they come from a distributed, geographically dispersed locations. So it makes defensive mechanism harder for you. And finally, one thing that has been basically that has been basically taken for granted is user confusion. As we talk about security principles, I'll let you know that one of the important security principle of having any security setup is its simplicity, because the security mechanism is to be used by the users. If your security system itself is basically complex, wherein your users are not capable to use the system, for sure that will be room for errors. For sure, the basic aim of the system will be compromised. Now, the attack, as I just told you, it's not just a single system. Rather, it's a collection of steps that are to be taken, not in the not basically in the strict ordering, but it definitely has this steps that have to be followed. It all starts with probing for the information. Here at this point of time, you try to disclose any of the vulnerabilities. Now you try to find out the backdoors in the entry, or backdoors. You try to basically find the backdoors on which you can cache the system, on which you can basically compromise, on which you can basically make use of. Once you found out these vulnerabilities, you call such step as probing. The next step is gaining an initial access to the system. Here, the attack groups, we call them as remote to local attacks. remote to local attacks. At this point of time, you try to gain an initial user access to the system. Once you are having the initial user access to the system, maybe you are having a user access, you want to have a super user access. Now these attacks are called remote to local attacks. At this point of time, you try to have something called privilege escalation. You try to gain the super user privilege. Once you are having a super user privilege, you would basically try to find out the next targets, and you would eventually try to basically you will basically crash the system, and at this point of time you can do any of the thing that you wish to. Now your attacker is having a super user privilege, he can do anything he wishes to do at this point of time. Now, as I just told you, the first step is to discover the network vulnerabilities. Now, what's a vulnerability? Now, vulnerability is a weakness, is a drawback. I mean, some security loophole, some security gaps that might basically prove an entry point for an attacker. An attacker would basically try to cache on certain level of vulnerability to get access to your system. Now, I have basically categorized these vulnerabilities into two groups here to make to make this discussion little easy for us to grasp, because I couldn't for sure be able to cover or list all the vulnerabilities in just such a brief lecture. But for sure I'd try to make an attempt here to give you a little information of most of the things that you should be, that where you are vulnerable basically. Now vulnerabilities can be of two types. It would be vulnerabilities prevalent in the communication media, or it could be the vulnerabilities prevalent in the communication devices. Media, I mean your network media, right? Your coaxial cables or any of the network setup through which your data basically flows. We call that as a transport media as well. And the vulnerabilities that are prevalent in the networking devices, in the user devices, maybe your switches, your routers. We talk about those vulnerabilities as well. Now, talking about the vulnerabilities prevalent in the network media, we are having one most common vulnerability, that is called port mirroring. Now, as we know that we are having a switch basically is aimed to transport a data fragment or data segment from one device to another device. Now, switches were devised basically an enhancement of the hubs, right? Wherein you do have a selected repeat of the datagrams. Now, in case of port mirroring, what happens here is that your configured switch, you are having a configurable switch. It can be configured in such a way that any of the data item that arrives at the switch, maybe I was sending a data item from this from one PC to another PC, but since that data item reaches to the switch, this switch is having a port that's called a mirrored port. What the switch does is that it sends a copy of all the data item it receives, not just to the actual destination, but to this mirrored port as well. Now that is called port mirroring. Now this port mirroring was basically put there as a security feature so that you would be capable of finding any problems if any problem arises down the line. But for sure, if your destructive users gets access to this switch, they might be capable of getting all the information. Now that's as simple as that. Port mirroring. Second, the second thing that you are having that is basically inline in the network media. Here in switch mirroring, you would basically send a copy of the data. That was basically that was not inline. The data shouldn't be necessarily going to that port. Rather, in case of network tapping, you are putting a network tap. A tap is a three-way connector that you are putting between the sender and the receiver. A copy of the traffic goes to the tap as well. You are connecting and monitoring port. Here also, I just told you it was basically for a security reasons to basically find out if there is any issue. But if again any destructive user gets access to the secure network tap, for sure you will be compromised and you will be vulnerable. And then we talk about the false ceilings. See, for sure your cables, they should be basically put in the concrete. if you are putting them in false ceiling, they might prove a vulnerability wherein some user might get access to the physical cables physically and would cut them and would basically implant RJ45, or maybe they would basically listen to something called wiretapping. Now that is again a vulnerability, that is vulnerability prevalent to the network media. And one more, unprotected RJ45s. How many times would we see in the offices we are having so many of RJ45 connectors? We are in any external person, if he gets access to the premises of the building, they might get access to they might be able to connect their devices to your network media and would be able to sniff all the traffic. That's again a vulnerability. And finally, your cables, when your cables come out of the building, they might be basically exposed to the public. And that is again a vulnerability. That vulnerability might be cached again here. Now, that's enough for the network media vulnerability. Now, let's talk about network device vulnerabilities. The first of the prevalent problems with the network devices is the weak passwords. We basically assume, or we basically take this setup for granted. We put very weak passwords. We put some obvious passwords, maybe my name and my date of birth. Various very obvious passwords. Now, no matter how much security setups I have put in place, no matter I have used VPNs, no matter I have used firewalls to communicate, to provide me a sense of security. But if my end users are if my end users are basically using a simple passwords, if my end users are basically using a complex passwords, and they are writing it down somewhere, now that is basically going to be vulnerable. That is going to cause you a vulnerability. Now you have to make sure that you have a proper password policy wherein it's explicitly mentioned how long your password has to be, what should be the minimum length of your password. Now, how frequently you should be able to change the password. Now, that is something called password life. Now, how often would be you able to reuse the password? Now, if you want to have enough of security, you should have a password policy in place. Now, for sure, you should never be writing the password, and you should not. I personally have done it. I would keep a complex password, and then I would put all the passwords in one note and I will write it down. But that's actually a vulnerable. If somebody gets access to that note of mine, for sure everything will be compromised. Now that is something that you should take. You should give proper attention to. Now, you are having default accounts as well. Many a times, see, the literature says that of the all the security attacks or the security issues that arise, just 35% of them arise due to programming errors, or just 35% of all the errors are there in the nature of the system. Rest 65% of the errors, they are basically the configuration errors. There are, of course, the security features in the system, but while deploying or while installing the system, we didn't take care of those things and we left ourselves vulnerable. Now, your systems would come with default accounts. How many times all of us would have actually installed Oracle database? It has a default account like Scott Tiger. Your Windows NT, they have default accounts. So you should basically, after installing a system, you should try to basically, these default accounts are created there just to let you install the systems. Once the system is deployed or installed, you should try to close these default accounts. You should make sure that there are no default accounts available. There are no default accounts, up and working on any of your system. Backdoors. Now, these backdoors, they are kept by the software developers to provide them a way to access your system in case of any uncertainty, in case of any problem. Now, if for some reasons, Dr. P. Saravnan, yes, sir, do you have any issue here? Backdoors, okay, never mind. I just told you about backdoors. These are the default, these are the accounts, or these are the ways that are basically put up by the software developers in the system, so that if for some reasons, if you try to basically access the systems, or if basically it lets them to remotely host or remotely access your system. Now you should make sure your backdoors are not unchecked. You should make sure that your backdoors, you know what the backdoors are, and you should make sure that you give access to only the users who are authorized to access your back. Now, one more problem is privilege escalation. You should give users a very little privilege, but many a times a users might try to basically override their privilege. Now that's again a vulnerability. Privilege escalation, give users privilege, very little privilege as they need. I'll tell you, that's a principle as we go forward, principle of least privilege. Wherein our focus is to give user as little privilege as possible. Now, many a times a user, we might basically let a user to do a su command on Unix, wherein he tries to get a super user privilege. Now that is basically your privilege escalation. That is again a vulnerability. Now there are of course operating system vulnerabilities as well. Now your operating system vulnerabilities, your operating system has a virus. It's basically it doesn't have any security setup in place. You couldn't configure the operating system clearly. Now all your networking devices, they have some level of operating system. Maybe some of them have a very general, very basic operating system. Some of them will have very high-end operating system. But of course there is some level of control program or some level of system, we call it, that basically is responsible for the functionality of the system. Now that is basically a lines of code. Now there might be certain problems in that lines of code, and that would basically prove to be an entry point or a vulnerability for you. Now those are your operating system vulnerabilities. Now you are having vulnerabilities in your softwares as well. All your network softwares, they might, while devising program, while creating the flow charts, while basically writing down the programs, we didn't take consideration of basic, certain very basic issues, like we didn't make proper use of the pointers. We didn't basically check the limit bounding. So we didn't actually think of security while at the time of writing the programs. Now, of course, any of the things that you would basically get from these things, these programs would basically be security issue. I mean, they would of course be vulnerable. Now, you should basically make sure that from the point you try to write the programs, you should think of the security. Now, if you don't think of the security, for sure you will be basically vulnerable at the later point of time. Now, those are the vulnerabilities. Now, talking about the network attacks, it's all of us know that network attacks, we can categorize them into two types. One of them is basically active attacks, or one of them might comprise attacks. Now, passive attacks, they are just, it just limits your communication. Whose mic is on? Can you please turn it off? Hello? Mic. CS Bavartani. Can you please turn the mic off?
Yes, sir.
Thank
I have
you.
turned off, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Now, attacks, as I told you, an attempt to compromise the security of a system. Now, you categorize your attacks into two types, either passive attack or an active attack. In passive attacks, you just aim to compromise the confidentiality of the system. You just listen to something that you are not supposed to be listening. Now, that is basically your passive attack. And in case of active attacks, you change the information, you fabricate the information, you modify the information, you interrupt the communication. That is basically your active attacks. Now, talking about some attacks that we talk about here is denial of service attack. In case of denial of service attack, you try to keep the user or the service busy. You try to keep it so busy that it basically tries, or it basically is unavailable, or is basically enable my screen froze. It basically is not capable of handling the legitimate requests. Now, TCP sink flooding, ARP flooding, ICMP flooding. Now, those are basically your denial of service attacks. They basically keep a system busy, keeping it busy with doing something that it shouldn't be doing. Or maybe we were having a session here. If all of you try to turn on your mics, now, for sure, we'll be keeping the system busy, but nobody would be able to listen anything. Now, that is basically denial of service attack. Second is spoofing. In case of spoofing, you basically impersonate, or you basically deceive somebody. I am impersonating here someone. So that is basically a spoofing. I change my IP address. I change my MAC address. I deceive you in believing that I am XYZ. Now that is basically a spoofing attack. Now, man in the middle attack. Now, man in the middle attack is basically any person listening to your communication. Now, any person interrupting or intercepting your communication. And finally, replay attacks. We'll talk about them as well. Now, denial of service attack, you try to make the resources busy, the services busy, and you try to make sure that they are unaccessible to the users who basically actually need them. Okay. Now, a variation of this is distributed denial of service attacks. We are in requests for the services. They do not come from a single geographical location or a single PC, rather that comes from a group of PCs. Now, second is IP spoofing. Here in what you do is that you try to hide your IP, or you try to basically deceive a user in thinking that you are someone else. So you basically spoof somebody's identity. Spoofing attack. Here, what happens here is that you are sending a packet and you are setting the target, I mean, some IP address, you are changing that your IP address to somebody else's IP address. Now, the target or the receiver or the server, that after it gets the packet, it doesn't actually know that who was the user that communicated to me. Now, you are taking somebody else's identity. That is basically called IP address spoofing. Now, attacks we are having here that we call DNS poisoning, or we are having ARPA poisoning. Those attacks are basically spoofing attacks, right? Now, man in the middle attack, there is somebody in your normal flow of the communication. He gets access to your communication. Now, that is just as simple as that, listens to your communication. Finally, replay attacks. See, I asked Pungrali ma'am, what's the time now? She tells me 10:30. Now, somebody of you already listens to that, my communication. He knows that I had asked this valid question previously. Now, they simply replied, I mean, they simply replay these attacks. They simply replay these messages to Pungrali ma'am. Pungrali ma'am, what's the time? What's the time? What's the time? Now, those attacks are basically called your replay attacks. Now, your attacks, you might be basically capable of defending certain attacks. I mean, taking consideration and take of security while you are programming or while you are deploying the systems. But there are certain things that are basically prevalent in the nature of the system itself, right? Protocol-based attacks. These attacks, for sure, our communication needs some level of protocols. Now, protocol provides us three things. It provides us your protocol, it provides you semantic syntax, and it provides the timing of the data flow. Now, there are certain issues with the protocol itself, right? Now, those protocol-based issues, they might prove to be vulnerability, a cause of vulnerability for you. Now, there's a protocol, as you know, a TCP control. We are having a domain name system protocol. If you want to access any service on the internet, you need to know its IP address. For sure, we don't know the IP address, we know its website or we know its URL. Now, but internally that URL is converted to the IP address by something called a domain name server. Now, this domain name server provides you the mapping of IP address and the URL address, right? IP address and its URL. Now, if this domain name itself is poisoned, if this domain name is basically compromised and it points out to some invalid IP address, you would for sure not be able to get access to the actual server, as is the name here. Here, an attacker, what an attacker is trying to do, it basically changes the IP address of certain machine to its own machine. Now, in future, if any person wants to access certain services and that IP address isn't there, so they would never be capable of doing that. That is basically called domain name poisoning or domain name server poisoning. Second protocol-based attack is ARP poisoning. How all of us know that we are having, the MAC address stored, right? In the MAC address table, we'll be having the MAC address for each of the machines stored. Now, if that MAC address table is itself poisoned, so you would never be able to come from, or you would never be able to reach the particular destination. That is called a MAC address poisoning. Now, that basically lets you, you can basically steal the information. How? Because you are trying to put the MAC address of, maybe you are in the switch, you are not the particular MAC address, and you basically pretend, or you basically spoof for the switch in believing that you are the actual person. Now, any of the message that is to be sent to some other user, that would be basically delivered to you. Now, that is basically called MAC address spoofing. Now, you are having TCP packets or TCP segments. This is the TCP header all of you are aware of, right? Now, this TCP header, you know that we are having three-way handshaking in case of TCP connection establishment. Now, that TCP handshaking, that might prove cause of vulnerability. Now, at any point of time, when a request for a connection arrives to a sender, sorry, to a destination. Now that destination reserves some resources for the sender, maybe a port number, maybe some sequence number, maybe some other resources. Now after you send, you reserve those requests. Maybe you never got an acknowledgement, the final acknowledgement that you are supposed to be getting from the sender, that to initiate or to basically indicate the establishment of connection. You are waiting for that. What happens is that the user sends you a lot of sync requests, but they never send you an acknowledgement. That is basically called sync attacks, right? Or sync flooding. Now, this TCP protocol, you cannot basically establish at this point of time. In the second step, the server, it waits idly, or it's basically idle. It cannot close the connection. It has the connection has to be closed. I mean, some resources have been reserved for this sender here, or for this client here. You cannot close the connection of your own. Now that basically proves to be a cause of vulnerability, wherein the sender, who doesn't actually necessarily need to communicate, he sends just the connection initiation message, and this lets this server over here, lets it reserve its resources for this client, or rather it exhausts its resource. That is basically a problem. Now same thing happens, I mean, in your connection termination. You were basically finishing a connection, but you couldn't finish. You are not this person over here, this sender over here. After you send him a sync finished packet, you are supposed to be getting an acknowledgement packet from the sender. Now if the sender doesn't send you the acknowledgement packet, for sure you would never be able to release these resources of your own. Now those basically prove to be a vulnerability. Now some vulnerabilities are there with your what's that your TCP flags. Now you might use some TCP flag in your segment number. Now there's a flag like sync flag. Sync flag indicates the initiation of the connection, and finish flag initiates the closure of the connection. Now you should definitely, there is no way on the earth that you should have a packet that is having sync flag and the finish flag enabled at the same time. Now, if your software is capable of creating such packets which are capable of doing a sync and act in the same packet, sorry, sync and finish in the same packet, for sure that would basically bring down your system. Now, that is basically a vulnerability, right? And sync flooding, as I just told you, you are sending a syncs at a higher rate than the receiver is capable to, then the receiver is capable of holding. Now, at this point of time, you try to exhaust the receiver of all the resources that it has. And once it's exhausted of all the resources, it would no longer be capable of handling any of the connection requests from any of other users. Now, same thing I told you about connection, closing a connection. Now, talking about IP header, you are having a TCP header, you are having an IP header. Your IP header basically lets you route the packets through the internet. Now, many a times your packets would be, a bigger size than the actual maximum transfer unit. Now, your what IP layer does is that it fragments your IP packets into smaller data fragments. Now, at the receiver side, these fragments are to be assembled. Now, you can have some attack here that's called a teardrop attack. What happens in the teardrop attack is that you basically when you try to reassemble the attacks at the receiver side, you get some malformed attacker or some malformed packet. Once you are having a malformed packet there, you would never, your system will freeze. Now that is just, that's called the teardrop attack. Another attack is called ping of death attack. What happens in ping of death attack is that while the receiver tries to basically assemble the received packets, when it reassembles them, they basically exceed some carrying capacity. Now that attack is called ping of death attack. That is again the attack capable, that's the protocol prevalent attacks. They are basically vulnerabilities within the protocol. Now, what we can do here is that you might basically see these attacks are basically, these data, it's basically assembled at the receiver site, at the end destination site. Now, for sure, if you get a packet that basically exhausted the carrying capacity, it would basically eventually freeze the system. Now, that's it about the attacks. That's about the vulnerabilities. Now, what should we basically be doing to make sure that we are basically at least having certain level of security, if not all. We should be following certain security principles that basically lets us have a certain level of security on the internet. The first level may be the layering. You should never rely on single security mechanism. Rather, you should have the layers of security. If your passwords is being broken, fine, you have OTPs. If your OTP is being broken, fine, you might be having your iris. Now that is basically layering. If your main door gate has been broken, you might reach to the corridor. Now in the corridor, you are having fingerprints, you are having your biometrics. So you are having the security devices at the different layers. Even if one is compromised, you are having another layer at your service. Limiting. Limiting means you give least privilege to the user. You do not trust your users. Give them as little privilege as they need to carry out their routine task. Now, this principle is called principle of least privilege. Diversity. You do not rely on single type of defense. Maybe in layering. Layering tells you have the defense at different levels. Now, all these levels should not be similar. You shouldn't be using password systems for everything. Maybe sometimes you use biometrics, somewhere you use an iris scan, somewhere you use basically a password, somewhere you use maybe a voice command. Now, that is basically called diversity. You should be basically having diverse defensive mechanisms. Then, one important thing is obscurity. You have something important with you. Why you want to advertise about it? Let it be hidden with you. So nobody will basically try to provide, I mean, nobody would show any attention or interest in you. You hide the secure, you hide the data within you, you don't advertise, you have money, okay, keep it hidden with you. Don't claim that I am having the money. So no robber will basically try to rob you. So that is basically called obscurity. You hide the information. Now here in case of obscurity, you might be basically disabling the banner grabbing. You display very little information on the router's web page, on your web server's information. Okay. Now that is basically called obscurity. You hide the information. You hide as much as you can. Simplicity. You cannot basically deny this thing. Your security systems, they are to be used by the users. If your security systems are basically confusing, Bhaskar, Mr. Bhaskar, was that? Simplicity. Simplicity means you make your systems usable. Okay. Your security setups, they are for sure to be used by the systems. Now imagine a situation where in your security system or your security policy asks you to have 128 character long password. Who is going to use that? Nobody at all, right? So your security system should be simple to use, right? Then it should be basically having, you should be capable of finding your weakest link. Okay, weakest link means that you should know where you are vulnerable, right? And once you know where you are vulnerable, you would put your more effort there. Now that is basically called a weakest link. And your defense mechanisms, they should be fail safe. Fail safe means if for some reasons a failure should happen, they should basically prevent the information, or they should basically prevent the access to information rather than allowing all the access. Now that is basically called uh, a failsafe. And certain possible security measures that are there at our disposal is authentication. You authenticate users by using passwords, maybe by using password, by using fingerprint. You try to find out the identity, or you basically make sure about the identity of this person. Now that is basically called authentication. Non-repudiation. Non-repudiation means that I sent you a message now and later I shouldn't claim that I didn't send it. You received a message and later you shouldn't deny that you didn't receive it. Now that is called a non-repudiation. There should be some level of contract, a third-party system that is basically uh, checking, or that is basically analyzing the communication from me to you, right? Now you may make use of biometric. Biometric just provides you, it's basically called something you have. or rather something you are basically. Now your authentication that is composed of three things: something you have, something you know, something you are. Something you know is basically your passwords. Something you have, they are basically your hardware keys, your access tokens. And something you are, that is basically your biometric, right? Then cryptography, that is basically provides you basically the confidentiality of the information. You convert your information into plain text, from the plain text in the user unreadable form, so that only users who are having access to that who should be able to access that information, they can, right? Then digital signature systems, it lets you have the authenticity, or it lets you basically prove your identity over the systems. Now you talk about HTTP versus HTTPS. Now the first step that happens in your cyber secure HTTP is that they share their digital IDs. Now these digital IDs are just like your identity cards that let you prove your identity over the internet. And then private key, public key infrastructure, your digital signature systems, they are basically built on the public key infrastructure, wherein you are having two different keys, one for encryption and one for decryption. Now, certain attacks and certain measures that you should be taking those to basically find out, or to basically defy those attacks. If somebody is trying to get access to your system, you have a firewall to prevent that. Now, if somebody is already in the system, then they are basically trying to override their privilege. They are basically trying to have some certain software bugs. They are trying to exploit them, like your buffer overflows. So you have an intrusion detection system, an intrusion prevention system. You have an antivirus system for that. Now, denial of service attack, you have an intrusion detection system for that. And one more technique you have, that's called ingress filtering. Now, TCP hijacking, you are having something called IP security. Just like your OSI security model, your IP security is a security model, is a security protocol, or rather a security reference protocol that is a layered protocol. It tells you at what level, it's a detailed protocol for securing your communication from the sender to receiver. Somebody is trying to gain your access to your information. You basically encrypt that, and you are having social problems. Maybe users or somebody, I got an email a few days back. It was from my boss, claiming to be my boss, and he wanted me to buy him iTunes cards. And he was like, you send me iTunes card, I will pay you maybe day after tomorrow. Then I just checked the domain from which he was sending the email. It was something, that was from Nigeria. Now you should be basically falling prey to this spams. You should be basically falling prey to those, spoofing attacks. Many a times, how many of us would have gotten a message or an email that you have won this much of lottery, now you need to just pay this much of money. Now those are basically social problems. Now, the only way you can deal with social problems is that you educate your users. You educate the users about the possibility, about the need of the security, about the ways to secure the system. With that, I feel we should basically stop here. And that's it from this session. If there are any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Now
Thanks a lot.
Request the audience, if any questions is there, you can either have it on the chat window, or you can just unmute yourself and you can ask it.
Nishanti Subramaniam raised her hand. Yes, Nishanti?
Nishanti, you can ask a question now. So thank you, sir. I hope there is no question from the audience side. So we had a wonderful session. Thank you so much for sparing your valuable time, sir. So if any question on the chat box, I'll let you know, sir, so that they can have a communication with you and they can clarify their doubts, sir.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Doctor.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you, sir. I request the participants to fill the feedback form which is there on the chat box.
Madam.
Dear participants, only for 15 minutes.
Dear participants, the link will be alive only for 15 minutes. So please fill your feedback forms.
Once the feedback is filled, you'll be getting the certificate in your registered mail ID. Dear participants, will not be opening the feedback link again. Fill your feedback link.
I request the participants to fill the feedback form. We request the participant to fill the feedback form so that once everybody has filled the feedback form, we can end the session.
முடிச்சாச்சு வெளில வந்துடலாமான்னு தெரியல.
Okay, participants, thank you. I'm ending the meeting now.